Welcome, everyone, to DevNetwork's Developer Week webinar series. I'm Patrick Gallagher, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this week's featured webinar presented by Harness.io. Harness automates the entire continuous delivery process, uses machine learning to protect you when deployments fail, and equips you with the enterprise-grade security every step of the way. Continuous delivery has never been this simple. But before we get started with speaker introductions, I'd like to remind all of our attendees a few things. Number one, live chat and Q&A is available during the session. You can raise your hand in the chat or ask questions in the Q&A section of the webinar viewer. So that's to the right-hand side of your webinar viewer. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. In addition, handouts will be provided or actually have been provided. So on the handouts tab, you can select and then download these materials. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and made available within 24 to 48 hours for additional viewing, reviewing, and you can also send it off to your coworkers. But let's head on to speaker introductions. Joining us today is Tiffany Jachja, Evangelist from Harness.io. Tiffany is a technical evangelist at Harness. She is an advocate for better software delivery, sharing applicable practices, stories, and content around modern technologies. Before joining Harness, Tiffany was a consultant with Red Hat's consulting practice. There, she used her experience to help customers build their software applications living in the cloud. So, without further delay, please give your undivided attention to Tiffany. Tiffany?
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Patrick. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the session. So as you know, we're going to be talking about continuous integration and continuous delivery. And then we're going to share patterns and practices for enabling that process. So no matter where you are in the journey and what you're doing for your continuous integration and continuous delivery practices, hopefully the session can be informative, fun, and informational along the way and kind of help you with these processes. So a little bit more about the agenda for today. We're going to define what is continuous integration, what is continuous delivery, how does it play into the ecosystem and the process and transformation around DevOps. And then we're going to break down the components of a software delivery lifecycle. So what does it take to continuously do software delivery, right? And so we're going to talk about the build process, the test process, and deployment process. And along the way, I'll share some tips and patterns around continuous integration and continuous delivery. And we'll end with a Q&A session. If you have any questions during this presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll get to all of your questions at the end, or if I catch them during the presentation, I'll make sure to address them as well. So hopefully this can be a great session for you. And without further ado, I'm just going to get started. So when we talk about continuous software delivery processes, we're really trying to enable the DevOps journey and the DevOps and the benefits of DevOps, which is around delivering business value to our customers and doing it in a repeatable and sustainable way. And so when we talk about continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is also called CI/CD, it's a practice that comes from DevOps, from the DevOps methodologies. And essentially, it enables this life cycle of responsibilities that development teams and operations teams owns in order to deliver software or deliver value to a customer. And so when we talk about a continuous integration process, it typically refers to the development processes that our teams own and our roles own. So anything from planning the services and the code that's going to be created to creating that code, packaging it up and testing it to ensure that it works. And then taking that package and actually delivering it into an environment and into our customers' hands. And so this whole cycle is what we refer to as continuous software delivery. And continuous integration and continuous delivery make up these processes. And sometimes when we talk about continuous integration and continuous delivery, we tend to mix them together, or we try to conflate the two terms, but they're two separate things, and they each have their own focus. And so we'll actually break it down in terms of that in this presentation. And so I actually want to go over the continuous integration process. And so in a continuous integration process, it essentially owns all of our development workflows. So when you think about continuous integration, you want to think about the build process. So if you have a Java application, for example, you'll typically do a Maven or a Gradle build, and that build will compile your code, package it up into a WAR or jar file that can be run into any environment. So a continuous integration process is typically triggered by some type of developer action. So if I commit code, or if I do a merge or a pull request into my main branch, that'll trigger the process for building and testing our code. And so when I talk about development workflows, it's really about enabling developers to work together in teams, and to be able to develop features, long running features together. So a big challenge in development workflows really is people working at different speeds, right? If one team is developing a feature, another team is developing a feature, and they have to work in the same repository, how do they do that while avoiding merge conflicts and then still being able to test certain aspects of the code? So being able to verify that these changes work and that they're fit to go into our stable branches, right? So continuous integration is about integrating our code changes into our repositories or into our code bases to ensure that they're working well. And so that's a little bit more about continuous integration. I actually want to go into the sort of tips around continuous integration, right? And like the name suggests, we want to focus on integration when we talk about continuous integration. And so a big component of any type of integration process is verification and testing. And so that's why I kind of have this triangle at the bottom of the screen, which shows the different kinds of tests that we have within software. So at the bottom, we have the tests that are the cheapest and the most inexpensive to create, to run, and to have. And those are our unit tests, right? So in a unit test process, you don't need to do a deployment. That code can run statically, and you can even run them locally. You can run unit tests locally to ensure, before you even trigger a continuous integration process, you can ensure that the code compiles, a specific component works the way you expect it to. And that's how we should focus, and that's how we should think about our continuous integration process as well, is we want to be able to fail fast and catch these processes early on. You don't want to do a deployment. You don't want to get all the way to the end of a deployment process and then realize, oh, this code doesn't work, because essentially what you would have been doing was you were continuously integrating failures into your process, and that's not really sustainable. And so one of the things that continuous integration that you want to do in a continuous integration process is streamline the development workflow. So it's pretty common that developers own this continuous integration server or continuous integration solution. So they get to pick and choose what ends up in their processes. So you can essentially decide, like, oh, if our team is spending a lot of time managing branches, how do I have my continuous integration also work with my source code management tool? And so those are the components that you want to integrate into a continuous integration pipeline, if that makes sense. You want to make sure that you're automating the build, that you're testing the build, and that you have visibility into your actual builds, because what continuous integration does is it ensures that you can actually have visibility into what was being built, what version of what code changes were being built, and how whether or not they passed. And so that's one of the benefits of continuous integration and why you would want to do it. So hopefully that gives you a good sense about the build and the continuous integration aspect. we did like a short poll just now. If you want to share, like, what kinds of tools are you using for your CI pipeline? There's a couple of different ones out there, and they all essentially help simplify the process of getting from a code commit to an artifact that we can deploy. Sometimes that means building the container image and putting it into a repository and storing it into a container repository. Sometimes that means like packaging that jar file or that WAR file that we're building and putting it in there and tagging it as a release candidate. So that's a little bit more information about that's some tips around building and continuous integration. And so let's talk a little bit more about continuous delivery, which captures our operations and kind of our security workflows that we have within an organization. So continuous delivery is the process of enabling safe and repeatable delivery of artifacts into environments. And so it's everything related to securing infrastructure, provisioning that infrastructure, releasing our artifacts into different environments, rolling back if there are any issues, being able to determine if and monitor our applications to see if they are working well. And if they're not working well, how do we manage that incident, or how do we roll back that deployment that we just did? And so the goal is to, as we go across different environments, to increase the rigor and the standards that we have to getting into those environments. In a development or in a lower environment, you typically just want to you typically just want to roll out your services quickly, right? You don't want to have this long, complex service mesh in your environment. You kind of just want to know that that your application is working. You can do some type of sandbox, some type of a small or minimal monitoring or load testing, and then ensure that it works so that it's valid enough to go into a QA or a test environment. And this is when you start to involve more people, right? This is when you may do additional integration tests or end-to-end tests. It may be where you have your change approval board take a look at the changes and determine if this change is valid and is okay to go into production deployment. And then in a production deployment, you definitely want to ensure that your artifact that was built is stable. It's been verified in other environments, and if there are any issues, that you can roll back and ensure that you have all the pieces in there to make sure that everything is working correctly. And so these are the kind of things that we worry about when we think about continuous delivery. It's a little bit more than just simply shipping something and having it run in a certain environment. It is really about how we integrate with other solutions. And it's actually a great place to start including additional practices. So something around continuous delivery pipelines is, like, you can think about how you want to bring in infrastructure as code practices. So when we talk about infrastructure as code, that's the practice of applying a version control into your infrastructure, how you provision your infrastructure. So that's your YAML files, that's storing how you want to do your upgrades, how you do configuration. The last thing that you want in a continuous delivery process is to have this anti-pattern where people are doing manual deployments, or they're doing things manually on a local machine, and you don't have any visibility into what those changes were. You don't have any visibility into which machines got what type of treatment versus another. And so it's just about standardizing and being able to track all of that. And so that's actually a common practice that people will employ, is like, okay, let's just do away with this anti-pattern and store all of our configuration and all of our changes as code. Another aspect that people will typically employ into another pattern or practice that people will use in a continuous delivery pipeline is change management. So you typically have like this type of ticketing system to manage deployments. And if that deployment looks fine, a change approval board or someone will manually approve this ticket and say, okay, it looks good. Or, oh no, this doesn't look good, there's this issue, or, I don't think we should do a deployment this week, let's put it off till next week. That process is typically manual, and if it's either manual or it's fully automated. And so traditionally, a lot of CI/CD platforms will make you choose between one or the other. But the reality of it is, like, this change management process shouldn't exist outside of our continuous delivery process. It shouldn't be like this completely separate thing that we have to manage manually, because then it becomes difficult to kind of gain insights into what is being delivered, when is it being delivered, why is it delivered, who delivered it, and that kind of thing. And that can be really challenging if you're in a heavily regulated industry, like in healthcare or in banking or finance. It can be difficult because sometimes you need to prove or do audits of your deployments. And so there are ways to integrate now. I think it's worth looking into how you can make API calls or integrate it into your platform, because it is a big part of a deployment, and it can actually, manual processes tend to add additional lead time when it comes to deploying. And so it's something to think about. Another aspect to think about in a continuous delivery process or continuous delivery pipeline is how you're managing secrets and security. So it's around encryption. How are we storing encryption keys? How are we storing secrets? So another aspect that you should think about in a continuous delivery pipeline is how are you managing and securing your continuous delivery pipelines, and how are you even managing access keys into specific environments. So if you haven't had the chance to look into ways of securing your continuous delivery pipeline, it may be worth seeing like what you can use. Like, can I integrate Azure Key Vault, or can I integrate my current encryption service and use it with my continuous delivery service or solution? Another aspect is monitoring. So when we talk about monitoring, we're thinking about our metrics, we're thinking about tracing, the whole observability suite. So something that I think is worth thinking about is, not only what you're generating in terms of logs and metrics, but also how you're storing them and how you're able to view those insights while you're doing a deployment. Again, it's not really scalable if you have one or two engineers monitoring for 24 hours after a deployment to ensure it works. Monitoring and metrics, it should be a responsibility that we share across all of our delivery teams. And a lot of the thought leadership around DevOps and around accelerating software delivery states that we can't help but to have these cross-functional delivery teams. And I think that's why we see this emergence of the SRE role, DevOps roles, kind of bridging the gaps between how traditional development workflows work and how operations workflows work. Because they typically don't mesh very well. In a development team, you typically want to go as fast as possible because you want to work on features that matter and you need to ship out, you need to meet these customer requirements. And in an ops world or workflow, you typically want to do the opposite. You want to ensure that all the changes that are being made aren't breaking things. And typically that means changing things less often. And so our continuous integration and our continuous delivery pipelines ensure that they automate this assurance that we need, and this confidence that we need that our applications are working the way that we expect them to. And so that's a big portion of continuous delivery. I do want to also spend some time to talk about deployments, because some people don't even get to this aspect where they think about the different release strategies, and they think about how they should structure and think about deployments, just because of the sheer complexity that's involved. And so if you're at this point where you're thinking about investing into canary deployments or blue-green deployments, it's something that's worth I think that there's some patterns and practices there that's worth thinking about. And the biggest thing is the way that you release an application should be the same way that you roll back in case that there is something wrong. So service meshes, if people are using Istio or Envoy proxy, they help do sort of this release strategy. And the release strategy is how you release a new application. So think of it as I have an application running in a production environment, and customers are using it. And I want to deploy a new version of that instance. So I have this instance running, and then I want to just deploy a new one. And so the release strategy defines how you employ this new service that you want. And so there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. In a rolling deployment, you have this one service going that's already up, and then you spin up a new one, and you essentially roll down the old existing one as you roll up this new service. And if there are any issues, you essentially stop the service that you're rolling up, and you keep the one that's up is already up, and so you're fine. That's your exit. In a blue-green scenario, you're shifting traffic. You wait until both services are up, and then you shift traffic over to that new service. And so if there are any issues, you just shift traffic back down. And in a canary deployment, you gradually do it between services. So there's a couple. There's only 3 release strategies that people talk about when they talk about continuous delivery. Those are the 3 practices. And if you're doing a canary deployment, just know that if there are any issues, you do have to figure out how you want to bring back up that service. So just have kind of an actual plan if you're going to be thinking about deployments, about how you want to do a release strategy on a particular environment. Typically, in a lower environment, you would do a blue, green, or a rolling deployment just because it's faster. But one of the trade-offs is it's faster and easier to implement. But one of the trade-offs is you have to essentially have twice as much compute services. So if I want to have 2 services running up, the new one and the old one, then I'm essentially running double the compute capacity, right? Double the CPU and double the memory that I need. And so that can be pretty expensive in a higher environment, and that's why people will typically do a canary deployment to higher environments. And essentially, whenever you're thinking about deployment, it's to fail fast. Once again, in the lower environments, just like you would in a development practice, you want to fail in the non-stable branches. You want to fail in the development branches. You want to fail locally. You don't want to fail somewhere else. You don't want to fail in the CI process. Same thing in a continuous delivery process. You want to fail in a lower environment. You don't want to get all the way down to a production environment and then realize you have this huge issue, and suddenly everybody has to go into the room now, your SREs, your security team, your test team, and you have to explain why something is broken. That's probably the worst case scenario. And if anyone's been a part of that, they'll probably know, like, you tend to want to avoid failing in a higher environment just because there are more stakes involved. And all this is to say, just think of your continuous delivery pipeline or your CI/CD pipeline as your gatekeeper. It's supposed to lock out anything that fails. So if I try to commit code and it doesn't work, it should fail. That code shouldn't be integrated into a main branch. That code shouldn't have even gotten into the continuous delivery process at all. And so those are things that you should be thinking about, is how do I put in these little control points at each step to essentially do some gatekeeping on my changes. And that's how we really build up a lot of our CI/CD capabilities. And so we discussed a lot of things, a lot of concepts in this session. So I did want to leave you all with a slide that kind of captures all of the key takeaways in this presentation. So the biggest thing I would say is focus on tests, because tests apply for both a continuous integration process and a continuous delivery process. And so if you don't have these control points, like I was saying, then you're essentially accelerating failure. Every change that you make tends to be a failure, and that's something that you don't want, because it can ruin the flow that you have within your organization. And so focus on building tests if you don't have them. If you're starting out in a continuous integration or a CI/CD pipeline, if you're just building it out, a lot of the capabilities, ensure that you have a healthy amount of unit tests, and then you can slowly figure out, well, how do I want to bring in continuous integration aspects, like um, integration tests, load tests, performance tests, regression tests, that kind of thing. And you can slowly build up and start to say, like, oh, how do we do end-to-end tests? How do we automate the deployment of 3 different environments and 3 services, and then launch some tests and ensure that those work? And that's sort of the nature of DevOps and about automation, is that you want to ensure that those things are working fine first, and then build it up from there. Likewise, around continuous integration, you essentially want to simplify your development workflows. So instead of having to manually check, oh, is this style okay? Maybe like bring that into your continuous integration process. So even doing like a sonar cube or static analysis on your code may be worth something that helps simplify a lot of your development workflows and kind of enables that longevity that you want in a code base. Because again, like, technical debt accumulates, changes accumulate, people come and go on teams. And so in a development workflow, you really do want to cut down on a lot of the practices that take up a lot of space and that don't scale. So those are my main takeaways for CI/CD. That's all I have in terms of content here. I'm more than happy to take questions. I did want to also say that we have a Harness community, community.harness.io, and that's a great place to kind of connect with me and any other Harness folks. We try to share a lot of content around how do you use Harness, how do you build a CI/CD pipeline, what are the things that you want to know, what is feature flagging, what is, like, all these aspects to continuous and continuous integration and continuous delivery. So it's a good place to connect with us there. You can also try Harness for free at harness.io. We have a full 14-day version that you can use, and then it gets converted over to a community edition, which is free forever. And that's also a great place to kind of learn more about Harness and what we do. We help people with their continuous integration, continuous delivery processes. We also help these solutions scale in a cost-effective way. So we're growing really fast, and we have a lot of products. And if you want to know more, it's a great place to get started. But with that, that's all the content that I have. Let's see if we have any questions.
Yeah, so we have, Tiffany, it looks like we've got 5 questions. Maybe if you want to take them from the top.
Sure. So we have a question around, what are some tools for testing in a continuous integration pipeline? That's a good question. So as I mentioned, you can have unit tests, which are typically tied to whatever application framework or runtime you have, right? If you have a Java-based application, then you typically have like JUnit tests or whatever else you have there. And so it's actually pretty common to have those unit tests, but also integrate specific testing frameworks if you have those. So in some cases, you can actually build integration tests using dependency injection frameworks. I know that Google has one for Java that's based in Java. It's called Dagger, specifically Dagger 2. So you can use dependency injection frameworks to kind of test out 2 components within your continuous integration process. And that can be pretty useful if you're working on sort of a very small aspect of your code, and you know that it integrates or it interacts with other parts of your code. That can be pretty useful. Another thing that people will invest in is that static code analysis. So I've seen people use Sonar Cube to do the static code analysis. And what that does is it actually runs through your static code, your source code or whatever, and it checks to see, are there any security vulnerabilities? is that you can actually upload some rules around coding style. So if someone's using tabs versus spaces, or someone doesn't have variable names in the same style, like maybe it's camel case versus having underscores or something, you can ensure that that is available. In terms of other tests that you can do, it's fairly common to do simple load tests. So for Java, there's JMeter, but I'm sure you can find an equivalent that will generate tests. That does require a deployment, though. You typically have to deploy your application and then hit that live application. And so that can be something that you decide to do as well. Just want to make sure we don't have anything in the chat. Okay. So I hope that answers that question. If anyone has any additional questions or suggestions for tools that work for them, feel free to mention it in the chat. How about security and made as a DevSecOps? Definitely, yeah, security is a main part of DevOps, and especially whenever we talk about DevOps methodologies, it's like you can't leave out the security aspect of it anymore. And I think, when we talk about DevOps and we talk about CI/CD processes, they're supposed to help enable that security aspect to it, right? And not make it harder. I've seen in some cases where people pick up continuous integration or continuous delivery platforms, and it essentially has to force them to use a new encryption practice or a new encryption workflow, and that isn't really helpful for developers, because then they suddenly have to learn this new encryption algorithm, and you're wondering, like, why did this not reduce toil but add to my toil? And so that's something to think about too, is like, how are we enabling security into our processes, and the whatnots. So that's a great question. I thought this webinar was going to include a demo of Harness. So no, there's no demo of Harness planned in here, but you can catch a quick 5-minute video of Harness on our website, harness.io. If you go into the tab continuous delivery, you'll find a really quick demo of Harness. And yeah, you can definitely try it out. Reach out to us in the community if you have any questions. We're more than happy to get to that. Any tips around GitOps? So GitOps is, so I think with any Git-based workflow, it's sort of worth investing in, because we see a lot of that ecosystem getting built now, especially in the GitHub side and GitLab side. Is like so many of our capabilities are now in tandem in sort of the same platform as what we use to store our code. So like I can store my code, or I can check my code in a repository, but now I can open an IDE and edit that code. And so it's definitely worth looking into GitOps. There are drawbacks here and there with GitOps. Essentially what GitOps does is it enables Git workflows into operations workflows. So if I have some infrastructure, I can actually put it into a repo, and that infrastructure will sync to my changes and my code base. And so we actually have some material around GitOps and Git sync on the Harness blog if you want to learn more about it. It's a little bit out of scope for this talk, but there's a lot of great content around it. And I know that a couple of people who use Harness or who have looked into continuous delivery, they actually use GitOps to enable application onboarding, so they can quickly onboard applications because they can actually use like a Git sync feature within their CD process, and it helps. So definitely look into GitOps if you're interested in onboarding applications or doing huge migrations. That can be pretty useful. We also have another question on how do you make the decision between changing the test versus changing your code to pass the test, if that makes sense. Yeah, typically you want to ensure that your tests are up to date. So sometimes you may have changed like an approach. Like I remember one time this organization wanted to do more asynchronous programming, and they wanted to use reactive programming. And so if you're not familiar with reactive programming, it's essentially event driven. And so then because they had changed everything to event driven, they actually had to change how they were doing their tests. So their JUnit tests actually had to had to be changed to work with promises and futures, so essentially asynchronous programming. And so the best thing you can do is just ensure that your tests are up to date. But just know, like, you do have to change your tests to work with their architecture sometimes. Otherwise, but essentially that test has to be a source of truth. So if it's no longer a source of truth, that's when you tend to see people have continuous integration processes where they just turn off tests and they just build. And that's the last thing that you want to have happen, right? Ensure that your tests are working and that they're testing correctly, and then go from there. That's when you know you can change you should be changing your code and not your tests. Great question. Next one is, how do you deal with database schema changes where both the new and old version of the app will access it simultaneously? I guess you just have to make sure you don't make incompatible changes. Yeah. You can also version control your database schema. But yeah, you do have to be pretty smart about how you're making changes. The version. Yeah, sometimes some people will architect additional capabilities to like migrate data. If you need to do that, then sometimes people will do like nightly shifts into the database. Databases are hard to deal with, but there are database schema versioning tools like Liquidbase, and I think there's like a few other ones, but Liquidbase is the one that I know people use. Great question. Would a service mesh be used in production? Yeah, I mean, you can use service meshes pretty much anywhere. They do cost quite a bit of infrastructure. So typically, service meshes will be only in certain environments. I haven't seen any service meshes working in a development environment, maybe in a sandbox environment where people are still trying to figure out like how to use a service mesh. But service meshes provide a couple of different features when working with microservices. They help with the security. They help with the networking. So if you want to get faster networking, they help with there's like four pillars to service meshes. But yeah, it can be useful to use it in production. I think if you use a service mesh, you also get like Canary deployments and Blue Green deployments automatically. So it can be kind of useful there if you are struggling to implement certain release strategies. But service meshes come with a lot of overhead. So try to think if it makes sense for your production environment. If you're going in that direction, then I know that there's actually a service mesh comparison website that does it. And I can actually check what it's called. It might just be service mesh comparison. I think you can. There's actually a whole website that's dedicated to comparing features between different products, service mesh products, and they actually help teach you like what you want to be thinking about if you're deploying a service mesh into a production environment or into a specific cluster. So hopefully that can help you. Service mesh are not easy. And we have a final question here. I believe you said that canary testing is not used in higher environments. Can you explain why it is, why that is, and how you define higher environments? So canary testing is actually used in higher environments. So you typically do use it in higher environments just because it's safer. And if there are any issues, it's easier to manage the network shifting. And higher environments refers to production environments. So when we talk about higher environments and we talk about artifacts that go in from lower to higher environments, we typically use this term called promotions. So we're promoting our artifact across environments. And when you do it across environments, it hits different teams and it hits a different scale. And so when you think about your development environment, it's usually pretty small. And then you think about your QA or your non-production environments, it gets a little bit bigger. It's a little bit closer to what a production environment looks like, just because you want to do the testing and you want it to be accurate to that application when it's actually live. And so once it hits a production environment, that environment is typically clean, right? No one really has access to, not too many people have access to it. Only the people who really need to have access to it will have it. And so typically, like, developers don't even get access to that environment. And so that's why it's called a higher environment. And it's also called cleaner as well. It's just a way of thinking about the different environments that you have when you're doing a deployment or delivering something to a customer. And so that borrows from continuous delivery practices and processes. It's just additional terminology.
So, Tiffany, thank you very much for the great presentation and the answers to the questions from the audience. I just wanted to remind everybody before we finish up that if you have any additional questions for Tiffany, you can hit her up via email. The email's right up on the screen there. I imagine, Tiffany, you could, if somebody did want a demo of the full-scale product, that you would be able to put them in the, into touch with somebody who could do that for them. As well as this session has been recorded, and we will be making this session available after the fact in about 24 to 48 hours. Look for that email with a link so that you can forward it on to your coworkers, or you can look at it again. The recording will also be added to devnetwork.com, our archive of content from our webinars. And I wanted to thank Tiffany as well as Harness.io for the sponsorship of today's very informative webinar. And thank you all for participating, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.